If you haven't already rated and reviewed the Single Tracks podcast in your podcast app, now's the time to do it. We're randomly selecting listener reviews to read on the show, and if we choose yours, you'll get a free Single Tracks hat in the mail. Hit pause right now, write a quick review, and then listen to future episodes to find out if you won yourself a hat. Happy trails. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Renee Hutchens. Renee is a mountain biker, storyteller, and artist living in Colorado. As a member of the Diné Nation, Renee is an advocate for both Indigenous people and the lands that they call home. Thanks for joining us, Renee.
Thanks, Jeff.
So tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up and how did you get introduced to mountain biking?
Yeah, so I'll just start off with my introduction. Ute Renee Hutchens Yenishe, Twitch Eatney Nishle, Belagana Bushchin, Chapahan Dashche, Belagana Dashanella. This is my introduction in Navajo, just for those who are listening, and it shares my relationship with how we relate to one another as Diné people by clan, and tells of my relationships and just centering the kinship with who we are as people to one another in the land. And I grew up, I was actually born in Oklahoma, but actually grew up a lot in northern Arizona and Kayenta, Arizona. A lot of my family is near the Four Corners on the Navajo reservation. And for me, biking was always about, I started at such a young age. It was really that kind of what we identify or experience as adults today in terms of just feeling like a kid and that freedom and, being out on the land. It's so peaceful, and so a lot of that is still much of my experience today. But as a kid, this was expanded my horizon of that playground in the outdoors. We had a huge long dirt driveway with acreage, and so it's funny, as a kid you can go for, maybe you're only going from point A to point B is like 500 feet or 1,000 feet, but it feels like miles. So that was a way to experience and connect with the land as a kid. And I would say then I didn't know that it was so much based in our Diné culture and our way of experiencing our identity and all those things that are attached to who we are as people today in terms of our song and language and traditional knowledge, but it was really growing into that and maturing into that as a kid all the way up until now. So my aunt's the one that actually taught me how to ride a bike. I would say my brother was my inspiration, but we had no training wheels. It was like that running behind kind of style, and you just let him go and open your wings and hope you stay upright.
Yeah, right on. Did you know like adults that rode bikes, or was it like mostly just a kids thing, sort of where you grew up?
It's definitely a kids thing. I feel like my cousins and my group, there's 4 siblings on my side. I had several cousins. We all kind of were within a year or two of each other. So it was kind of our crew or pack that we would cruise the neighborhoods and create our little sketchy drops and jumps off curbs or mud puddles. And we were always creating fun on 2 wheels. So it was definitely a kid's thing. It was kind of like adults are doing their thing and we're going to go cruise on bikes.
Yeah. That's an experience that I think a lot of us can probably identify with. And, some of us, though, chose to keep doing it. We started as kids and some of us never really grew out of it. So that's cool. Well, one of the things that you've written about is a concept called environmental justice. And that's a term I haven't heard a lot. On the surface, to me, at first, it kind of sounded like, doing the right things for the environment. But from what I've read, that it's it's also about people, or maybe it's exclusively about people and how they interact with the environment. So what does environmental justice mean to you?
Yeah, environmental justice actually came about in terms of just the terminology came about in the 1980s, early 1980s, and there's a whole discourse on this field and how it came about. And its origin of the term environmental justice came about because of people in the environment in that interaction. And there's a book that it's called As Long as Grass Grows, and I highly recommend that book. It actually is several chapters, but one specifically that really dives into this further on the history of it. But as far as how this affects or impacts Indigenous peoples and kind of where this movement of environmental justice came about, it really points at several things, and one of them is it first takes positioning ourselves to really unpack what this means. And the way we do that is by actually looking at the history of Native peoples' relationship with the United States as an environmental history. And, to tag on to that, it's where it becomes problematic, or the justice or injustice issues, is the Indigenous ways of understanding land and human relations with it are obstructed or not even recognized at all. And then on top of that, you look at the numerous barriers to Indigenous people's participation in the governance of environments or just their own land itself. And so when you're left out of these conversations and left out of the stewardship part, and you can see there's a lot of injustice there. And part of that can actually, you can even look at the land dispossession, and you can take the example of how national parks came about. There's a whole book on that as well called Dispossessing the Wilderness. And it's about the Indigenous people's removal to create those national parks. So you can see how it gets very complicated pretty quick. But what I will say is that environmental justice and taking this into the realm of the bike industry and outdoor industry is, I almost see it like also operating in the same way, because there is so much Indigenous erasure in the narratives related to outdoor spaces and the land base in general. And that's where you get problematic route names and, so on and so on, which I know we'll get into later, but that is also an injustice. It all is rooted in that history of how Indigenous peoples were impacted by colonization in the past, and that's still ongoing today.
Yeah. And is this exclusively like an Indigenous issue? I mean, when we say environmental justice, are we talking about Indigenous people only, or can other groups kind of experience these these environmental injustices?
Well, that's a good question. It definitely applies to all people, all human beings that may be negatively impacted by, for example, policy decisions. And how part of this came about, what impacted Black communities. And you think of how waste or mining or pollution, you can talk about environmental racism, which will look at that intersection of race and environment. And then you can also talk about just low income populations who are greatly impacted and affected, that are higher risk for some of these environmental hazards or whatever it is we're looking at in terms of the environment. So yeah, it is that's why I think it was important, like you asked up front, is, how do we view environmental justice? Well, you can't talk about the environmental part of it without talking about people.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess there are plenty of examples of this that are perhaps related. I mean, you have the Flint, Michigan water crisis, or the, Hurricane Katrina, even, where there is that intersection between race and the environment and, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, that is something that I guess we're all sort of aware of, but we're not necessarily aware of like all the factors that go into that and what causes it. So
Absolutely.
as you kind of hinted, a lot of mountain bikers probably don't realize it, but most, if not all, of the iconic riding spots, mountain biking spots in Colorado and Utah are actually on Ute tribe ancestral lands. And you support a group called the Ute Land Trust. What is their mission, and sort of how is this all related?
Yes, this is something that I plan on talking a lot more about this coming year, and just about the land trust model and what that is and what that could mean in terms of partnering, giving back, or engaging into healing those relationships with Native peoples.
Mm-hmm.
But the Ute Land Trust specifically, it was established in 2018 by the Ute Indian tribe to assist in the healing of those deep wounds left by the injustice of violent removal of their people from their homelands, which encompass Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. So every land trust will look slightly different because, it's important to note that the tribal nations, they're unique. Each one is unique in terms of their language and culture. And so, we're not this monolith. And so that's important to keep in mind. And so if you look at that and how that works for land trust, is that each one is going to be different because while colonization and that violent removal or land dispossession impacts all of us, we can see that they're going to be in different regions geographically, and with their traditional knowledges and what they're doing is going to vary. But I know for the Ute Land Trust, the way that they're functioning specifically is that they have through donations of land as well as through cultural and conservation easements that they're restoring land stewardship and that return of their ancestral lands. And by having that land and stewardship restored, they're able to have ongoing traditional conservation efforts and are reclaiming traditional knowledge today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is that something that's happening in other parts of the country as well, or is this sort of a new model? You mentioned that the Ute Land Trust was just established a couple of years ago, which is crazy that it took that long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a whole history on this organization called Land Trust Alliance, and they actually have a webpage that kind of describes what land trusts are. And I think that it actually came about before when the Ute Land was established. These were conversations that were happening in the 90s. But I think it's important to know. I actually appreciate one of these quotes from a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And there's a quote that says, in the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything: identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. And that, to me, is really a powerful quote because it shows that this idea of ownership and land is not something that where this is where land trust came about. That's a very colonial or settler like definition of like, this is my land. I'm going to stake it. I'm going to claim it. It's nobody else's. But it's not that way for Indigenous people. We connect with the land as more than just this, physical ownership. That we, oftentimes I'll say to others that we are the land and that the land is us, and that these are our relatives. And so that's why these land trusts are huge. And they don't just come about just by land donations. I know that there's some in Northern California that are supported by voluntary, kind of like a land tax. That basically people in this region realize that they are capitalizing on stolen land. And so as part of this, there's these really city and urban areas like in San Jose and San Francisco where people will, who live there will see just buildings and concrete, and it's hard for them to visualize that this was native land to begin with. And there's native peoples that are living in Northern California today. But there's no way that they're going to be like, okay, I want to take away San Francisco and,
right.
That's going to stay around. But the native people there are just saying like, hey, like we're still here. And, we very much like need these traditional medicine and plants. And so there's been some cool like community gardens and shared spaces where a conservation, a non-Indigenous conservation land base will go into an agreement with the tribe and say, hey, let's both use this land, for our mission and for what you need as well. And so there's, like I said, there's many different ways this looks. And I know that as cyclists, like last year, I don't think there's one place in the U.S. that didn't feel the impact of wildfires. It was very smoky and it affected our ability just to be outdoors. I mean, of course, COVID was also happening simultaneously, but out of this horrific situation, there was a tribe in Northern California that was part of their function of their land trust was actually practicing traditional fire management and trying to work with the state of California to do this. So here's another example of how land trust, it really is a collaborative effort and benefits everyone.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting to hear your description of sort of the Native American, the Indigenous view of the land, like that it's not just a piece of property, that there are so many things that all of us as humans get from that. And it seems like there are so many parallels to sort of the environmental movement too, right? I mean, you've got just people realizing the same things, which, people have understood for a very long time, but for whatever reason, like we got away from that, or, there are groups of people who had different ideas. But regardless of who owns a piece of property, like we're all humans, we're all breathing the same air. We rely on the land and the environment and all those resources. We rely on sharing them and making sure that, that we're thinking about others and all that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting to understand how that's all connected, and it goes kind of full circle.
Yeah, it does. And this is why I advocate is that we aren't, a lot of times part of major policy decisions that a lot of, you can look at the past elections that came about and where a lot of, messaging came out was, around policies that necessarily don't always include Native people, about, and I'm specifically calling out public lands policy, efforts, or acts that are constantly put on the table that, there's just such a lack of understanding of that history of where public lands came about, and that it is stolen, Native land. And that's what we're just trying to say, hey, we're still here. We've been stewarding for thousands of years. And, this is where I feel like, the more that we can engage our community, especially, I wouldn't say I pick on the outdoor industry a lot, or the bike community, but it's just a space that I exist in. I'm very passionate about, and it intersects with my own culture. And so I want to see how we can, like you said, at the end of the day, like we all benefit as people. And we also, our Mother Earth is, and our planet Earth is also benefiting simultaneously.
Yeah, yeah. And again, as mountain bikers, we hopefully tend to be aligned with those goals in a lot of cases. You know, the bare ears development and, you know, oil and gas extraction that was being proposed there, or was ultimately, I guess, allowed for a little while. I don't know. I haven't haven't kept up with it in a while, but it was one where mountain
Right.
bikers were saying, no, like we want to protect this, like we enjoy it, using it for recreation, which, you know, I want to talk about that as well. Like, is that
Yeah.
a proper use? But also I wanted to mention there, you know, you were talking about being in San Francisco, for example, and sort of looking around and having a really hard time like connecting and imagining this as like, you know, native land and that sort of thing. And I saw a tool, actually like an online tool recently where you can, it's like a Google Maps type thing where you can look at the country and it shows like which tribes basically inhabited different parts of the country. And you know, I was zooming in, like trying to see, you know, where I live in the Atlanta area. And it was so weird because like this map
Mhm.
purposely, they didn't put, you know, Atlanta on there. There weren't like the highways,
Right.
right? Like I usually orient myself by like,
Yeah.
okay, here's I-85, like that's where Atlanta is. But you're
Yeah.
looking at this land and it's just like, this is just trees and, you know, grass and like it's really hard to
Mhm.
orient yourself and to get back into that space. But once you do, yeah, it's pretty. I don't know. It's different.
Mhm. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that experience because it's, again, like you said, you're immediately looking for those markers or those cities or boundaries or lines on a map, and it's
Hmm.
like how do you reimagine, and as we interact with these natural spaces, like how do we interact with and relate to the land that sees them as indigenous territories.
Hmm.
And a lot of people are like, why? There's, I see a lot of overlap or concentric circles that are kind of, how does that, play into it? And, I remind people that's why it's important to kind of see people, place, and borders, or and these settler bestowed land designations. How has that changed over hundreds of years? And so you'll realize that, like, so when you go to New York or New York City, when you see concrete everywhere, it's like, yeah, there's this land was sacred, and a lot of sacred sites are just covered up by concrete, today. And there's a really neat video online where you can actually see the colonization and onset of how it impacted the East Coast, and it just spread westward. And you'll see, unfortunately, a lot of Native peoples on the East Coast that just um, you'll just see it shrink and shrink and shrink, where some tribes or don't even have a land base, or
Yeah.
a reservation. And it's important that just because you Google a tribal nation, that if you don't see a reservation there or a land base, it doesn't mean they're gone.
Hmm.
It really should point at the fact that you'll see this align very well with policies and Native people's removal from their lands through colonization, and kind of
Yeah.
brought us to where we are today.
Yeah. Well, last year you successfully advocated for changing the name of a bikepacking route that was then called the Wild West route. And the name has now been changed to the Western Wildlands. And part of your advocacy was letting people know about sort of the colonial underpinnings of that original name. So were you surprised that it took a couple of years? I mean, this route was called the Wild West route for at least 2 years, as far as I can tell, before anybody realized that the name might be offensive to Indigenous people. Does that stuff surprise you, or is that something that we're always going to be dealing with?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, for one, because I feel like, to if I did an entire content analysis or name analysis across all trails, like this would be a full-time job.
Yeah.
And many times, right? Like imagine
Yeah.
how many trails are out there, and no one else, at the time, I guess, I'm not sure the history on it, but like certain things will come to my attention just out of my own, happen to run into it, or
Right.
talk to someone who mentioned the route.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say I always was, I'm not like someone who my mountain biking didn't have its origins in quote unquote adventure touring or bike packing. And so
Mm-hmm.
this was something kind of new, in terms of the type of uh, trails or routes that I was, coming across. So
Mm-hmm.
I know for me, if I knew that came out 2 years ago, I would have been on it 2 years ago. But it was kind of just the timing of interacting with those who were involved with the naming of that route, and
Mm-hmm.
having the opportunity to speak how I felt about it. And I feel like it was a very good conversation that was pretty educational, on their end, because, and also, not just in this trail or route name specifically, but in general, uh, sometimes people are really attached to a name, and it isn't
Mm-hmm.
always well received because there's so much attached to names. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why
People don't
it's
like
important to
change.
get right. People don't like change, and so it was presenting this in a way that it's not that you can remarket something that's problematic. And I think a lot of people want to do that,
Hmm.
just to say, well, this is what we actually meant. Our intentions were this. Can we market it like in today's Wild West, like what we think of Wild West
Hmm.
today? And I'm like, you
Mm-hmm.
can't. I use the example of the racial slur that's derogatory for Native people, like the word savage, and
Mm.
there's no repackaging that word. It's never
Yeah.
going to sit well. You know what I mean?
Huh.
And so that's what was kind of like my explanation, is that there's just terms that you can't, separate or undo or say, but I really want it to, this is really what I meant. Can we keep it this? And it's like, no, the answer is no. And so that's why
Yeah.
I thought that through, and I thought we got to change this.
Yeah, yeah, and there's plenty of examples like the Dirty Kanza race, and that was a name that people were super attached to. And I mean, to the organizers' credit,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like they listened, and they, again, had a lot invested in that name, and ultimately, though, walked away from it. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but what is like sort of your emotion when you come across something like that? Like the first time you heard, oh, there's a bikepacking route called the Wild West route. Is it like anger? Is it sadness? Is it frustration? Like what do you personally
Mm-hmm.
feel?
I immediately felt that there's no way I would ever ride this route.
Hmm.
It was it it made me almost all those that you listed, to be honest,
Yeah.
angry, and of like, here we go again. Like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
these the names of trails impact how you interact with that space or that
Mm-hmm.
place specifically. It situates you and positions you to have a
Hmm.
certain lens or experience. Like there's
Yeah.
really catchy names around here in Colorado, and they're like, hey, did you ride that trail, like Captain Jack or whatever? And it's there's something attached to that. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of people think, like, when I bring these up, that it's just about being politically correct, and this is not. Like, I remember writing that one pager for the press release, and I kind of started out writing that, and I thought they just need a few sentences, Renee, for the quote, and it
Mm-hmm.
ended up being a whole page long. So I
Hmm.
realized there was a lot of feeling behind that, and
Yeah.
and I'll admit there was tears that I actually cried,
Yeah.
writing that.
Yeah.
There's trauma and history related to that, and it feels frustrating to constantly see these injustices that are triggering of historical trauma of
Mm-hmm.
of Native people, and what what people want to attach to the quote unquote cowboy and Indian and the Wild West, and things that are very romanticized, of romanticizing Native peoples and thinking it's just like a fun and games, like, you know, Native mascots or costumes. And it's like, no, these are very harmful for Native peoples. And so to me, it felt a lot like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and clearly, it's not easy for you, right, to speak up about this stuff. And, you know, I'm sure you've been insulted, and it's hard too. I mean, I imagine that you carry a lot of that stuff around with you as well, like just kind of constantly seeing it and feeling like people still don't get it, right? Like, you know, I was going to ask, are there other brands or events in the industry that are still using these offensive names? And I think I know the answer, right? That there are, and, you know, either you're not aware of it or you're just too tired to even deal with all of them, right? Like, you got to kind of pick your battles and say, like, no, this one is like truly something that makes me and people like me angry, and, you know, it's got to stop.
Yeah, you definitely nailed that one. It's the answer is, you know, it would literally take one whole conversation just to go by region or by bike company, or if we're talking about trail names, you know, there's a large, I would say, and unfortunately, that's actually the norm and majority of the bike industry. And what I'm talking about specifically is yeah, I can't go off the bat and talk like specific bike names or anything, you know, because that would take a lot of detailing out. But I'm talking about two things. One is the cultural appropriation, that is so common that I am not surprised, and I almost expect it every time I go to a bike brand's website or a clothing line, bike gear, you name it. There's I pick on Handup gloves. They did not receive my comment very well, and I'm still have yet to push on that one. That there's, you know, Navajo rug weaving designs on their mountain bike gloves. I already pushed back on their gloves that said savage on the, when you held your hands up and spelled out savage. And that was kind of my initial contact with them. But, you know, I can think of several women's bike company gear and shorts that have patterns on it. Groundskeepers is, you look at their bike protection frame kits. There's one that's some techno, like that's problematic. That's cultural appropriation. If I'm as a viewer going to a website and I am not sure where that pattern came from, then to me it does speak cultural appropriation. There are some cases that they may work with Native or Indigenous artists to design those, but as a consumer, if I'm questioning, then don't put that question in anybody's mind.
Right.
And what I point to is, as a model of something that is done right, is Nike's N7 line. And I encourage companies, when I consult with them, go check out their website. There is no confusion when you go and look at N7 line that is cultural appropriation. The entire page has highlights of all the Native artists who designed some of the patterns, why they designed it, their tribal affiliation or background or story of why they created it to begin with. So that's where storytelling is super crucial. And I can say I've consulted with, in the last several months, with bike manufacturer brands that are rolling out bikes or names, or wanting, are in the process of changing names, because I realize that bike manufacturing or just product development is not something that happens in 6 months. A lot of these are 2 to 3 years out, in terms of name and product launches and all the marketing that goes along that. So I realize that change, after I consult with them, it's going to take some time to work at every single step to change that. But I really encourage to look at how you story and product launch and market, because the Indigenous erasure that was my second topic. That was number 2. My first one was cultural appropriation. The second one is looking at marketing. What kind of messaging are you having? I've had companies who, you look at that little IG tag on Instagram social that, I don't know if it still exists out there, but it says savage on it, and people just think it's, let's send it. Let's, all those like mountain bike type terms that are, savage gets thrown in there a lot. And it's just important to keep in mind, like, how are you marketing and messaging? And if you are selling any product, whether it's a bike, an experience, a route, you're always going to be talking about people, right? Marketing is going to involve people. Even if you're buying a bike, it's going to involve people. And so this is what I talk to brands about a lot, and companies, is that if you're talking about marketing, communication, and people, that these companies have a large budget to avoid litigation, to go into trademarking and all this. Like, we should have the utmost, highest level of moral or ethical best practice and standards when it comes to marketing. Not just what's cool, what's trendy, what's catchy. How is this impacting Native people? So that's kind of my overall, like, broad brushstroke of how to answer that questions for the bike industry.
Yeah.
Let's take a hard look at what our community space looks like. So there is that side of, increasing participation in these BIPOC in these spaces, but that isn't just the full answer. We're not just props to throw us in your gear and say we're doing diversity or inclusive work. It's like, let's look at this space, and when you see that space and how it is, and it's not inviting or doesn't feel safe, then that's where the dismantling has to come about. It's hard to challenge your friend next to you, or your family, or your crew, or whoever you're riding with, and say, like, hey, like, hey, don't say that, or like, whatever it is, like you said in the beginning, like, change is tough. And so there's multiple levels that this has to happen at to
yeah. And to be fair to people who are in leadership positions too, I mean, a lot of them, I don't think they would say like they purposely are excluding folks, but like your example of the name of the Wild West route, I mean, how many white men heard that name and were like, okay, yeah, it's a cool name. But then you hear it and it's like, wow, I feel all this anger and this frustration, and, because of my lived experience, which isn't the same as yours. And, there are things we can do, like we can have conversations, and you can, try to like make people understand. But like you said, at the end of the day, like, we need to have people in those positions that, can speak to that. You need to be a part of that brand, and not just a consultant. I mean, what you're able to do in that role seems like it's a huge step forward. But, until everybody is truly kind of like working together and really collaborating, it does seem like that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, because when I said consulting, I almost wanted to say, and that's not what we just want to see. It's just like these one-off, right? Like, we should be part of the fabric of the bike industry. We need to be integrated, like, in terms of position and leadership and involvement. So
yeah. And that's a question I hear a lot too, is, when the industry does talk about diversity and wanting to see more women and more BIPOC people participating, one of the sort of uneducated comments is often like, well, people should just do it, right? Like, it's up to them. Like, if women don't want to bike, then, that's up to them. But like you said, there are things that people experience that just, it doesn't appeal to them at the moment, right? Because of various things that, again, like, as a white male, I'm like, oh, all of this appeals to me. But again, that's just my perspective. And I know that others have different perspectives and experiences. Well, one of the things that you do is you advocate for land acknowledgement at mountain bike races and events, and also for trails as well, as we kind of discussed. So what is the purpose of a land acknowledgement? What does that look like, and what's kind of the thinking behind it?
Yeah, the land acknowledgements are, for one, I can talk about them generally, but I'll just quickly insert here that, like I mentioned earlier, is that every tribal nation is going to be unique, and in terms of what that plays out and what that actually will be meaningful to them. And because, for example, if someone asked me, Renee, could you do a land acknowledgement in the state of Maine? I would not take it upon myself. I would say, hey, it actually would be more appropriate if a tribe from the New England or in that geographic region, whose land you're actually on or holding an event, actually participates and provides input on what that means. Maybe it's a song, maybe it's a dance, maybe it's just a prayer, or whatever it is. It may involve their native language, it may not. And so that part's going to vary a lot, but the land acknowledgement is to center Indigenous people as to combat and address that eraser that I discussed earlier. That people, oftentimes thinks that we are not even here. I've had people who said, "You're the first Native person I've talked to," or "Wow, I thought you all were extinct." Like that's pretty offensive, but
yeah,
you know what I mean? That's the kind of questions people say. How are you still here? Like in shock, And I just have to kind of swallow, take a few deep breaths, and answer that kind of question. But it really will always say that we are still here, and that's why it's important, like how you talk about Native people. We're not called the ancients. We're not talked about in past tense, only because we're here today, and we still have all the, traditional, our knowledge and practices that we're constantly, restoring, that, have been, almost, the target for the U.S. government was to get rid of us physically. And they had many ways to do that. You have the policy era of the termination era, and then you have cultural assimilation. And so it really stands today that when you talk about Native people currently, it's powerful and it means a lot because of that, history of Indigenous people and our eraser. Like I said, just not only physically, but even in today in terms of narrative and representation. So to point back to that land acknowledgement, it's to disrupt that notion and to say, and we have been here as the original stewards for millennia, and this is the specific tribe, wherever you're at, whatever region you are, whatever land you're on, these are the people who have stewarded it here and still have that relationship today. So acknowledging those people today, and then also it's acknowledging their history that they experienced in that space. Like I said, every type of colonization or it's going to be different. Different tribes have different treaty names, for example, and treaties and statutes are not honored, historically by the U.S., our own U.S. government. And it's interesting how somebody can talk about their human rights or their rights as a U.S. citizen, and Indigenous people also have Indigenous rights, and we have hunting and fishing rights, and there's so much is attached to Indigenous identity. It's not that we just come in and say, oh, this is our land and we have rights to this water rights to this area. It's like, no, these are foundationally rooted in the Constitution and legislations and policies, which haven't always been, honored or acknowledged. And so sometimes when you are in certain areas and you do a land acknowledgement, it's important to actually do your own research and what took place on this land. It's going to vary by location to location, and so that's land acknowledgement in and of itself. It's about the people and the place and the history and bringing those stories back, and then that lays the foundation of going beyond land acknowledgements.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, it sounds like that's super important and can be a really powerful thing to do. But yeah, I imagine there are like actual actions that people can take, race organizers, trail builders, even us as individual riders. So like how can we get beyond just, kind of acknowledging like, yes, this happened, or this is, this particular tribe's ancestral land. Like what actions can people take that are just as impactful or even more so?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is, like I said earlier, that this is something that I plan to spend much of my time this coming year and beyond, because it's almost like a lot of writing that I've done. I've told my friends it feels progressive in the way that it layers and adds and expands that conversations. It furthers that conversation. I wrote last year about land acknowledgement on SRAM, and now we're, I had that recent article about our reciprocity with Mother Earth, and then there was the land trust. And so for me, this was extremely meaningful because it was an action or a model that I think it's so important, because I get this question a lot from industry, that how do we go beyond land acknowledgement? And it was great to spell out and just show one example of how you can go beyond land acknowledgement. And it's kind of like when we use this example of if you found something in your house and it didn't belong to you, and then you gave it back, if I just sat in my place and said, well, this place is stolen, but I'm going to chill here anyways, like, that's great. Like, move along, that the person would be like, hey, like, can I have that back, or can I be compensated? You know what I mean? There's still that, like, and I know that's kind of a little bit oversimplifying, but it does get out at showing that there's got to be some healing or reparations that follows, and that's when, depending on where you're at, like, I remind people, like, again, like, reach out to those tribal nations in whatever area that you're having, writing or land acknowledgements. One thing that I thought was really cool after I released the articles, I've noticed people tagging the land acknowledge, but also putting a link or tagging a land trust to donate, right with their land acknowledgement. And I thought that was cool to say, like, hey, here's a land acknowledgement, like, but this is a land trust or voluntary land tax or whatever, and they give whatever. Doesn't that amount's going to vary, but imagine if we go to trailheads all the time that are on state land, or you have to pay a $5 fee at the trailhead, for example, and we don't think twice. We're just like, yeah, man, we want to ride here, so let's go in. I pay $2, and it's $10 total or whatever it is, and it's like, if that added up, you think of how much traffic goes through some of these trails and spaces that we have, or those are just trails, but like, imagine Crankworks. I mean, look at where they're located, or these World Cup race series, or any kind of race, series. They're holding events on these lands, and so give, like, we need actual giving, like, or you know what I mean, like, in terms of as a start. If we can't do that, then we're just, we're always going to be at that 0.1 level of just a
Mm-hmm.
land acknowledgement.
Yeah. Yeah. So one question I have too, getting back to kind of individual bikers, is how we can exist sort of in harmony with the land. And are there like behaviors or things that as bikers we should be aware of? And I guess another question I have is are there lands where recreation isn't appropriate? Because as you mentioned, for Indigenous people, the land is about a lot of different things, right? It's a spiritual place. It can be, a source
Mm-hmm.
of medicine and healing and, all these different things. And so do those things like coexist, or are there certain lands where certain things are appropriate and other lands where they're not?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I feel like a good place to start is seeing the notion of consent or
Mm-hmm.
permission.
Hmm.
And again, if you see yourself as a guest on these lands, again, if I came over to your house and I didn't tell you, I just kind of like went in there, rearranged furniture and like swapped one of your rooms around and just
Mm-hmm.
be like, yo, that's not cool. Like that was
Yeah.
my workplace, or that was whatever. It, was, you had your own relationship with that space. It's similar where like it seems so rudimentary or very basic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like consent. It's just saying, hey, what can we, I see this in the climbing world. Like, can we go over here during this time of year and climb these lines?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever. I know there's those conversations happening, but when you just go there and you just say like, that's a cool rock face, I want to climb it anyways, or I'm, you know, this place has always been accessible and this is my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, let's rethink that, because your backyard is actually it's also Native people's land, and we've been left out of there. So you might not have been aware or seen that we are still trying to access certain areas for,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, medicinal purposes, or harvesting traditional medicine. And what is heartbreaking to me is a lot of our some some of our traditional practices or ways of connecting and carrying on our life ways
Mm-hmm.
means accessing these areas at certain times of the year. Like
Hmm.
sage and for example is like spring is upon us, and there's certain times for us as Native people that we're taught when to harvest, or
Hmm.
or not harvest
Yeah.
during these times. But you have spaces that are recreational, and they're designated as a certain space for this purpose, and we don't, as Native people, can't even access those areas, or our ceremonies are were criminalized
Hmm.
for just being who we are. I mean, this is
Yeah.
who we need these practices to live and survive. And so when you see people getting, Native people being arrested on, land that is sacred to us, or has, that's integral to who we are as people today, that that really is infuriating,
Yeah.
that like, oh, but we can recreate, or we can designate it as a state park, but you can't come over here and pray, or carry a ritual out, for example. And so
Hmm.
that's, again, like that's bothersome. So it's to keep in mind that as we are on the land, and maybe you've historically, like, this has always been experienced this way to you in terms of biking, it doesn't mean that because you haven't seen Native people involved in that space doesn't mean we don't care or we're not around. It's
Mm-hmm.
just there's reasons why we've been left out of those conversations. So
Yeah.
it, like, come to the table and join Native peoples to figure out what issues or what struggles they're ongoing in your land area. And like I said, how many times did we see when that public, hashtag protect public lands, that everybody on Facebook put their little keep spaces wild or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
like it took 2 seconds and everybody was like, yeah, public lands. But when Native people come to the table and we're just trying to protect these lands for our cultural practices, like there's almost zero public land lovers they're supporting Native people. So like where can we come together on this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it seems like as mountain bikers, we should be pretty familiar with this whole idea of consent and respect with regards to, where we build trails and how we access them. And I mean, there are places I'm sure in Colorado that the trails close certain times of the year for, elk calving or,
Absolutely.
bear issues or whatever, right? So we do this already for the environment, for animals, for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and hopefully, I tend to think that most mountain bikers are pretty respectful. And we talked to one guy who had done a study of mountain bikers to see sort of how awareness of certain environmental issues in an area affected their behavior. And his finding was encouraging, that people, once they knew, right, that, hey, there's an endangered species here, so like stay on the trail or like don't build illegal trails, was super effective. And so, yeah, hopefully that bodes well for us to build that awareness and understand that idea of respect and consent. And then, that we roll with it as mountain bikers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that, and I speak to that often. Is that we're it's not that we're trying to introduce something brand new. It's like
Mm-hmm.
we're already doing this with plants and animals and wildlife, but like let's add people. And that's
Yeah.
why I said, like, when you see the land or landscape, like always think of people, indigenous
Mm-hmm.
peoples. We are absolutely inseparable from that space. So let's add that layer to the conversation and how we interact and respect that space for
Yeah.
all.
I want to switch gears for a minute and ask you, what does it mean to you to see Deborah Howland appointed as Secretary of the Interior?
Yeah, this is a good timing because this is a recent and also a historical appointment for
Yeah.
Indigenous people. And I can say that even when she was up for as one of the nominations, like that alone, and just having it within grasp of her actual appointment was emotional,
Yeah.
in the sense of it was very um, powerful for Native people.
Yeah. Just to see her nominated. Did you think it would happen? Were you kind of just like, well, I'm really happy she did. She probably won't get it. Or yeah, were you real hopeful, I guess?
Yeah, this is like, I guess people's personal, like, half cup half empty or half full, but in
Right.
this case, I'm just going for the gold. I was I was pulling all for it, and I felt like it was already had done a lot of good in terms of stirring up some very positive conversations, even in her nominations, because it
Mm-hmm.
was allowing us as Indigenous people to express, just what you asked earlier. What does this mean to us? And it again, it's that joy and hope and healing,
Mm-hmm.
because her appointment is pivotal for tribal nations and this country. Not just Indigenous people, but this entire country and planet, because if just as a quick 101 on the Department of Interior, they actually oversee the protection of public lands, in
Right.
parentheses, stolen native lands, um,
Mm-hmm.
and the DOI guides the country's administration to fulfill treaty and statutory obligations to the First Peoples. So if you think of that alone, the DOI has, just like our history of this country, they've had decisions that have been detrimental to tribal sovereignty, such as land dispossession. So there's a lot of hurt
Mm.
and harm and distrust with the DOI, that I feel like that her appointment as secretary is actually a necessary step to healing tribal relations with the United States. And as Indigenous peoples, protecting our Mother Earth is always going to be connected to people and our environment, the land, waters, our communities, and really all life forms on this planet. So for me personally, I look forward to supporting her as she guides this country to find its path in confronting some big issues like the climate crisis, and finding strategies to restore our balance with Mother Earth and supporting the return of stewardship to Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, yeah. I like that you used the word balance too. And, I think a lot of times these discussions can kind of veer toward the political. And, in this case, as in every case, I mean, it's a big job, right? Like there are a lot of parts to this job. There's resource management, then there's the native issues and lands, and it's a huge thing. Recreation, which obviously as mountain bikers, we think is the most important thing. But there are so many competing priorities, and this is an appointed position. So, obviously she's not going to be there forever. There's been lots of secretaries of the Interior before. But this is, I guess, the first opportunity where again, you're getting this different perspective. Somebody is in that job that can look at these issues and kind of prioritize them in a new way, or at least bring like a new understanding to it. And, regardless of our political leanings, hopefully we can just appreciate the fact that there are a lot of different perspectives, and to do such a big job, it takes a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, it sure does. And I feel like Indigenous representation, is, this is one example, is her appointment, but this is exactly what I advocate in our bike industry. And it does matter, because like I said, you mentioned that there is a lot of pushback, or like I said, I've gotten death threats. It's not favorable or accepted. You know what I mean? Like this is a labor that I do, and every time I write, I almost just expect that there's going to be that loud and obnoxious and hate speech type of segment. But the more and more I do it, I'm constantly reminded and grounded of who I am, of why I do this. This is about justice, and people will say, well, who cares? Just call yourself a cyclist. Why does it matter that you're an Indigenous cyclist? Well, it's like, for me, our youth, at one point in time, I was in the earlier stages of the youth part, but like, where are our role models, and where are our leaders in today's world globally? And I want like our Indigenous youth to have role models and leaders and Indigenous athletes to say like, yeah, I can do that, or I can speak up. And so it does matter that our representation is felt, and they were actually seen and heard in these spaces. And that's why I do what I do.
Yeah. And not to a lot of personal benefit either. I mean, if anything, this is something that's really tough on you, right? I mean, nobody would choose to do something where they're getting death threats because of what they're doing, I mean, truly, that just shows how important this is, and how passionate you are to be able to take that on. Again, it's not like you're doing this to get rich or to, do some...
Yeah. We're not rolling in money, Jeff.
Right. Big land grab. We're gonna take back New York City. Yeah.
I wish it would be that, but it's not.
Right.
But it means a lot to me, so I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you shared a really powerful essay that you kind of hinted at earlier on the SRAM website about restoring our relationship with Mother Earth. And the concept of a sort of maternal earth force actually shows up in a number of cultures. Even the ancient Greeks kind of ascribed this feminine side to the earth and to the land. Do you think women have a unique or a specific role to play in education and advocacy for our planet?
Absolutely. And this is, I can say for my tribe specifically, we are matriarchal society traditionally, and what that means is that like my clan has its origin in my mother's clan and all the women and so on and so on. So it's how my tribe is specifically is organized traditionally,
Yeah.
and it's not, and even taking that out of the equation, like just every traditional society for each tribal nation or indigenous people, that's gonna look differently. But if you just look at our existence, like I'm here, it doesn't matter like whether you knew your mom or did not know your mom. This has nothing to do with that. But like I exist because I have a mother. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
I was born and birthed, and that is very symbolic to this life force that I describe in that article. Like it's life giving, and that's why I immediately led off the article of saying that like everything that we have, like if you just take out, like close your eyes for a second and think about where you would get food. I mean, you think of COVID when everything cleared off the shelves, like where do you get your food? You don't
Yeah.
always have the grocery store to go and grab, whatever food item you need. It's like you were always dependent on that balance and great respect and care of Mother Earth, because that's why for us as Diné people, a lot of our ceremonies revolve around harvest, because if we had a harvest, this meant we would physically exist and continue as a people. We were always embedded in this past, present, future, and way of interacting with Mother Earth that way. And so when you think of women's role in that way, it's like we are already kind of innately the life givers or caretakers of continuing life. And if we see that in terms of what our Mother Earth is, then we would immediately, like, as non-Indigenous people, you would immediately think like, wow, like it matters, like where how our watershed and water and is impacted. Like water is sacred, and it's just because I might be at the top of the stream and I'm enjoying clean water, like if whatever I do is going to impact somewhere, you know what I mean? So there's this deep interconnectedness and intersectional piece of how we view Mother Earth and her life giving. That's why we call our plant nations or animal nations. Like we have that same regard of them as we do like human life. And so if we started seeing mountains as our relatives or the water as that kind of relationship, we wouldn't just say let's kill that off, or we don't care about pollution. Like that's where I feel like that really speaks to, and I hope that came out in that writing.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way to explain it and think about the earth and our relationship to it. Finally, I want to ask you, what are some of the advocacy and media projects you're working on for this year?
Yeah, a lot of my projects I've outlined. I have my own like topics that I will be writing on, but I always say like the timeline of when that actually comes out will be is flexible, because I do like to keep in mind the state of our environment, what's happening in the political landscape, the bike industry, and like have it really, we have to admit that there's sometimes strategic communication in terms of when that happens, and so you have that kind of timeline of we don't know where things, COVID's and vaccines and how it's impacting our ability to be out and recreate responsibility, and where that means in the summer or fall. Like my work or my projects, they come out of my depths and from a very deep and meaningful place, that I often remind people that it comes from almost like a spiritual journey. And what I write, and that you kind of got at earlier, Jeff, is it's hard, and some of these topics, and I have the ongoing issues of what's going on in the world with the Asian American and Pacific Islander, you know, um, violence, and I mean, you name it. Like these impact everyone in this space, especially like those who can already identify with that kind of violence. That it could be any one of us, and so I remind editors or companies or that I'm working with that it's not just an on or off switch. When I worked in academia, it was great to write like a research paper. It was objective, and it would happen quite easily. But it's a quite different style, different type of style in terms of what writing projects I have laid out. And so I do have some plans to combine some narratives of land and waters, because a lot of times we hear the land, but it's as Indigenous people, this also includes our waters. And I'm a huge angler or fly fisher, so
cool.
I would love to combine, some stories of land and water, and in that sport of combining biking and fly fishing. Because if you see me during the summer, I have my fly fishing rod and my mountain bike on the back of my car. So
cool.
I'd love to put out some combination of stories like that. But I'll also be working on a couple films this year. This will be my first year directing my first film, and this will be focused on Indigenous land stewardship and
cool.
Traditional conservation practices. And so that'll be sharing that stories. And I have a new partnership with Specialized. We got some projects we want to work on rolling out this year to again give that visual and that film narrative to a lot of what I write about, and combining that narrative in a visual format for biking.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, that's a lot of cool sounding stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing the film and reading your writing, because I know it's a perspective that we don't often hear, especially in the bike industry, but just in general as well. So, I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us and to share your story and your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. It was great to be here.
Well, that's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.